right now. We don't need anyone to continue to confiscate people's properties.
Thank you. Okay. Motion on the consent calendar.
Moved.
I'll take a voice vote, please.
Okay.
Cedillo?
Cedillo, aye.
Fuentes?
Aye.
Bizarre?
Aye.
Harris Dawson?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to item number 1, a report from the city attorney.
Item number 1, City Attorney Report relative to creating a panel, the City Attorney's Receivership Program.
Awesome.
Dan Kreinbring, Deputy City Attorney.
Tina Hess, Assistant City Attorney.
Okay.
Do you want me to go right ahead? This is to request a panel of 2 firms to assist on the City Attorney Receivership Program. These 2 firms went through a complete RFP process, and they are now down to panel. And if we were to get approval, then we go into negotiation and execution of contracts, hopefully.
Any questions, colleagues? Okay, so why don't you tell us about this program a little bit?
Good afternoon, Councilman. As you're probably aware, the City Attorney has a number of programs which attempt to make our communities and neighborhoods safer. In particular, as they relate to nuisance properties, there's the Citywide Nuisance Abatement Program, our entire code enforcement program where we partner with the Department of Building and Safety and the Housing HCID to bring properties up from blighted conditions, occupied and vacant. What this proposal attempts to do is deal with these long-standing vacant nuisance properties which are bank-owned, where the banks really haven't stepped up to the table and done their due diligence in terms of bringing these properties into compliance, marketing these properties, and getting them returned to productive use. After considerable efforts at code enforcement and other types of discussions with the banks, a lot of it just falls on deaf ears. So the City Attorney has asked that we come up with a new program to take these properties out of the bank's hands, to have a court determine the best approach for dealing with these properties, which we are confident will be rehabbing and marketing these properties and getting first-time homeowners back into them.
Great. Colleagues? Okay. And so you're satisfied that we've got the sufficient financing for this? And
The program should pay for itself. The firms that have agreed to work with us on this will be compensated through the receiver certificate as awarded by the courts.
Okay. All right. Do we have public comment?
Yes, you do. Item 1. Sure.
Item 1. Patricia McAllister, Wayne, and Michael Millman.
Again, I look at the big picture. This happened in Germany. This happened in Russia under the Bolshevik regime, communist. First, they took the properties of everyone, and then they took their weapons. And Stalin went on to kill 60 million Russians. I see this slowly happening. Now you want to bring in some so-called volunteer attorneys to get these houses from people. I go to the city council meetings all the time talking about people losing their homes. We have enough people sleeping on the street. We don't need any more. So by you ignoring that and continuing to take people's homes, that tells me we've got big plans here. And the big plans is to turn this nation into a communist nation. You're doing all that you can. You had this bank scandal where people were put out on the street. They were swindled, and not one banker went to prison. And now you're still trying to get people on the street. That's no free stuff. That's all in the plan to get Americans on the street and turn this communist country into what is currently, right now, communist, but we don't know it yet.
Wayne from Encino.
Biggest thing you have to worry about is when a lawyer comes up to you and says, I'll do something at no cost. Yeah, attorneys working for free on a perpetual basis. That'll be a fucking day, right? So you go to these receiverships. I've went into the bankruptcy courts before, and they award attorneys' fees as costs. It's just a backhanded way to take it out of the housing price. In the end, they get paid, and they get paid royally. So if these properties are bankrupt, then the city can file an involuntary bankruptcy petition against the banks and take the shit away from them, and then give it an open market sale and use the open market proceeds to buy affordable housing, rather than displacing people and taking their homes through some sort of ruse such as this. So vote no on this.
Thank you. Mr. Millman.
I think, Mr. Chair, I'm on one on your special at 1:40.
Okay. Members, recommendation to adopt the city attorney report, request city attorney to come back in 45 days on the progress of the receivership, specifically on compliance and penalties assessed on the property owners, and to work with HCIT to leverage foreclosed properties. So moved. Second.
Studio,
City aye.
Fuentes,
Aye.
Bizarre, Harris Dawson. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to adjourn the regular meeting and convene a special meeting.
Item 1 on the special meeting is a motion City O'Farrell instructing HCID to report on the status of the city's permanent supportive housing program.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. So we're looking for the number of units constructed, those that are occupied and vacant, number of units to be constructed, number of units by council district. Help lay out a foundation for our ongoing conversation here.
Good afternoon, Helmi Hesrick, Assistant General Manager with Housing and Community Investment Department. And as part of this status report, we have provided you with a single sheet that summarizes the information I'll share with you. First, the request was for information regarding the number of constructed permanent supportive housing units and the number that are occupied and vacant. Since the Housing and Community Investment Department started a permanent supportive housing program in 2007, we have approximately exactly 66 projects, of which 38 have been constructed. 5 of them are currently in construction and will be constructed through 2017, and 23 projects are in our managed pipeline, and those will be constructed through 2019. It's a total of 3,000 permanent supportive housing units for the homeless. Of that, approximately 839 are identified for veterans, and 1,353 units are identified for chronically homeless. I should mention that there's overlap between the veterans and the chronically homeless. We do have units that are for chronically homeless veterans. The timelines, the other question is the timelines for construction, which I started to mention. The projects that are currently in construction, of those, 73 units will be constructed this year. An additional 44 units are expected to complete in 2016, and 119 are expected to be completed in the construction completion in 2017. And of the projects that are in our managed pipeline, they are in a variety of phases from pre-development through closing financing at this time. And those will be entering into construction and completing construction in the years 2017 through 2019. And you've asked for a map and a chart organized by council district showing the location of permanent supportive housing. So on this chart, it is a breakdown by council district of the total of all of the permanent supportive housing project. So there are, the total on this report, I'm sorry, is wrong. It is a total of 66 units, not 28. That's an error on the report. And, I had that corrected, and so I'm sorry I have the incorrect version in front of you. The breakdown is, as you can see, across the council districts. It is primarily in Council District 14, but it is widely dispersed throughout the city. On the back is a map of all the projects in the city of Los Angeles, and it identifies where the projects are located. And I will have an updated report sent out immediately. This was the prior version.
One of the things that's very obvious to me is this kind of concentration in 1, 13, and 14, with it moving down to 9. Want to comment on that?
The concentration reflects probably higher propensity for multifamily housing in those districts. So you generally see concentrations of multifamily housing in areas that have higher density, which are in the Hollywood area, downtown area, Central City, particularly Westlake and Pico Union. It probably also reflects where there's been a higher concentration of homeless individuals. The one thing I will say is that the permanent supportive housing development program, we do make an effort to disperse it throughout the city, and we will continue to do so. HUD has now adopted an affordable housing, fair housing rule that is requiring us to deconcentrate our development in areas that are where there's concentrated poverty. So we will continue to push for development outside of areas that lack opportunity for low-income individuals.
Yes, sir.
So how does this program actually work? The housing department, are these units that you have here listed units that the housing department subsidized to build? Percentage, 100%? How are these completed?
Typically, yes, these are projects. The projects on this list are projects that have been subsidized by Housing and Community Investment Department, and it does not represent the full universe of permanent supportive housing, because there are projects that might have been subsidized with, for example, just HACLA and
So
other.
for the number of units you've listed, housing could have subsidized 10%.
We
20%.
generally subsidize on permanent supportive housing closer to 30% of the project, maybe 40% of the project, depending upon how the project is financed. And that is just the local city subsidy. There is also a tax credit subsidy, and there's typically a subsidy for services. The thing that distinguishes permanent supportive housing from our typical affordable housing program is that these are aimed at housing individuals with wraparound services. So it's not only the capital for the project, but it also includes a rental voucher and a services component. So we partner with other funders in the county and with the housing authority or other rental vouchers providers for those other financing.
So what you've captured here is the permanent supportive housing where the housing department participated by providing a subsidy. There's other permanent supportive housing that is being provided either through the county, privately, or other forms. Do you have that information available?
I don't have it with me on this report. We can prepare that for you.
Okay. If we could just get a supplementary report. I know this committee, along with the Homeless Committee, would be interested in seeing some of that information. And I know in the presentation to the Homeless Committee, we were trying to get fill in the gaps from the reports we got, and that's going to be valuable, not only the city's contribution, but also well, it could go both ways in looking at this data, because we're saying we provided these units, but really we only provided a subsidy to these units. But then there's also a lot of others out there that are just being constructed purely by the county or privately, right? Does it make sense? I mean, to do a private permanent supportive housing unit, you need some type of subsidy either from the city or the county, correct?
Typically, yes. There may be providers that I'm not aware of that are doing it privately, but I'm only aware of what's being publicly funded. We have provided all of our data to both LASA as well as to the CAO's office. So it's my understanding that LASA has been conducting a survey of countywide permanent supportive housing.
Okay.
And our information is included in theirs, and they are looking at making sure they're not double counting units that are funded by more than one agency.
Okay. One of the things we should be aware of is that we are in an unprecedented time where the county and the city are working much more closer in terms of how do we address our housing needs, how do we address our homeless situation. So the city itself has to keep account of not only what we're doing, but also what others are doing, and continue to provide that information to all of us so that we could get a sense of where we are holistically and comprehensively in addressing this issue. And one thing that was very apparent when you and others made the presentation to the Homeless Committee is that there's a tremendous gap in terms of the available funding and the need out there. And we talked about that generally for affordable housing. Now, in terms of permanent supportive housing, does the housing department have a sense of what the need is in terms of what the discussions we've had and permanent supportive housing along with other types of housing? What's the need that we have either as a city in the data we have or even with the other units that are being provided elsewhere?
I presented in the Homeless Committee a report that estimated need, and what I would say to you is that the exact need for permanent supportive housing is still being analyzed in a comprehensive way. There's a variety of sources. There's the homeless count, which has an estimated need of some 25,000 units. There's also the regional housing needs assessment that estimates something on the order of 10,000 units for households earning below 30% of AMI. So there is work being done on developing a need. The housing department has capital constraints. So we are producing at our maximum available capital, and right now that number is 300 units per year that we've committed to have come out of the managed pipeline. It's approximately represents now about 43% of the production we're doing in the affordable housing production pipeline, and we are maxing out the resources that we have available to achieve it.
And my final question, Mr. Chair, on this item is to underline what the chair stated, and which is the efforts to decentralize services for homeless or those in need. And it's great to hear that HUD now is looking at that, not only for this city but throughout the country in terms of helping to decentralize and not concentrate services. It's not good for the homeless. It's not good for the community. It's not good for anyone when we do that. What happens now, because we've been in this kind of practice that if somebody wants to build permanent supportive housing, they're going to say, hey, I'll go and find something in Skid Row or Hollywood or Venice or wherever the concentrations are. When they come to your office, are you not only now legally bound with HUD, or what's that conversation like when you tell them, well, look, there's other places we could build this, and are the developers or whoever's building this receptive to that or not? What's the conversations like?
We have a permanent supportive housing acquisition fund called the Corporation for Supportive Housing Loan Fund that precedes the pipeline. And that loan fund is typically funding acquisition for permanent supportive housing. So it's the projects that are starting to come into the pipeline. They are somewhat, I think they've become more and more dispersed throughout the city without any policy direction to specifically do that at this time. So we do see more.
That's occurring.
I think it may be occurring because there's been a conversation taking place for a long time in the city about deconcentration of homeless housing, not pursuing it only in some areas. So I think there has been a natural orientation by the developers that provide permanent supportive housing to look for opportunities outside of particularly Skid Row and downtown. But there hasn't been any direct policy. There's no direct guidelines in our managed pipeline that requires, it be more broadly dispersed. I will add, one of the biggest problems that permanent supportive housing faces in getting developed is opposition by neighborhoods. So acquiring land for a permanent supportive housing project is also the process of building, having a sense that it will not meet opposition by a neighborhood, and that's a challenge that I know the developers face.
But we hope through the development of a strategic plan that we will be hearing in January that the policy directive on decentralization will be very clear there. And also the just adopted effort to have a coordinator for the city on homelessness. I think if we build that institutional knowledge within that coordinator and the infrastructure, we will have direct policy direction that we've lacked in this city. That you're right. I mean, it seems like people just talk about things that we should be doing, but we really haven't codified any of our policy directives with respect to homelessness, and that decentralization policy directive hopefully will come through the strategic plan. And I raise it now because I see Miguel Santana in the background who's working on that report, so for him to hear that again and how important that may be. But thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Question, a number of respondents bring up the issue of community opposition with respect to building affordable and permanent supportive units around the city. And I just wanted you to drill down a little bit on that because there are very few projects that are built of any kind that don't incur some opposition, and I'm wondering why it's talked about in a way that's fatal for these projects.
Well, I can give you an example, a personal experience example that I think is illustrative of what you're asking. So I worked on the Hollywood and Vine Hotel, which included affordable housing and luxury housing and a luxury hotel. And it had in Hollywood a little bit of opposition. Shortly after we closed that transaction, which included approximately, if my recollection was some $6 million of public subsidy, we proposed to acquire land a block away from that site in Hollywood for permanent supportive housing of homeless. And we had a public meeting with over 400 people come out to oppose the project. And a community activist wrote a newspaper article distributed within the community suggesting that this was going to bring predators in the community. Now, that's the kind of difference you see when a neighborhood is, two different types of projects have different types of reactions in a neighborhood. Ultimately, the work on the permanent supportive housing project was an opportunity for learning. The Business Improvement District leader took it upon themselves to conduct bus tours of permanent supportive housing projects throughout Los Angeles for leadership in Hollywood, and it actually became an opportunity for the business community in Hollywood to engage in ending homelessness in the community. So it was a good opportunity for learning. Not everything is a lightning rod the way that one was, but we have seen it occur in other projects where people's misperception of housing the homeless will impact a neighborhood. And so a lot of this is really an educational process. I would add that selecting developers who have a track record for quality management over the long term makes a big difference. Many of the housing developers that do the best job have less and less opposition to their projects because they have a reputation for having projects that integrate seamlessly into a neighborhood.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being a little late, but thank you for this tutorial on permanent supportive housing development opportunities, I guess the reality and the opportunities. Could you give us a little more detail on supportive? What does that mean? Is it one size fits all? Is it, I guess it's a whole variety. What's the range in support that's typically a part of projects like this?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. The department has really been growing in its knowledge of permanent supportive housing since it launched the program in 2007, and we've partnered closely with the Housing Authority and LAHSA and the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Health Services to really understand what best practices are. We've also been supported by Corporation for Supportive Housing and by Enterprise, Hilton Foundation, all of whom have been actively working on defining what permanent supportive housing is. Typically, what it is it's housing for very low-income people. There is a policy, general policy to work through the coordinated entry system so that people who are chronically homeless and need a lot of services can be housed in these low-income units. There will be on-site service coordination. So typically, the way we have looked for the project to be staffed is that there be at least one staff person per 15 tenants that is really identified to help the individuals stay housed, coordinate services. So people who are in the housing are paying rent, even if it may be a low rent, they're paying rent. And the idea is that they're treated as a tenant within a project, but that they may need some additional assistance in staying housed. Separate from the on-site sort of service coordination is a link to a mental health care provider or a health care provider. Many people in housing who have been homeless suffer from mental illness as well as chronic illness or severe or major illnesses. Many suffer from addiction issues. So those kinds of services coming out of Department of Mental Health and Department of Health are coming in as an additional service to the project, not funded as part of the capital, but there's a service agreement. So all of the permanent supportive housing projects have a service agreement relationship, and we work with the county to review those relationships. So we have a management plan that identifies what those relationships are. So there's both on-site services as well as off-site or linkages to health and mental health services.
Thank you.
Any questions, comments? Let me just ask you, why don't you give us the range? Like we start, someone's homeless, and then we've got supportive housing, and then what are the other levels? Then low income, and what are the categories?
Well, here, we
Back
have,
of the napkin.
okay, back of the napkin. So we have permanent supportive housing, which is service-enriched housing targeted to chronically homeless people, typically people who've been on the streets for a number of years and are suffering.
Right, and now, because I know this question was asked, and I want to ask you this. Okay. So within the county, does the county build any of that within the city boundaries?
I don't know if the county's permanent supportive housing is within the city. It may be. Not a lot of it will be within the city boundaries, but they do have a development program for permanent supportive housing.
So, pardon me, Mr. Chair, so that could a project get capital support from both the city and the county?
Many get support from both the city and the county. Yes, this is typically the financing for this type of housing is a layer cake with multiple agencies participating in the funding. The tenants' rents are very low, and so you can imagine it supports a very little bit of debt. Mostly it's subsidized through tax credits and then local subsidies.
So, and I don't want to lose track because I do want to know the levels myself of different housing, but just a little more on this. I'm trying to get a sense of how I'm assuming that the county would have a regional plan where the city has a city plan, and I'm just trying to get a sense for how those overlap, or is it just happenstance, whoever shows up with all their paperwork?
Oh, to be in the housing?
I mean, no, not to be in the housing, to get your
I'm not as familiar with the county's system. They also issue notice of funding availability and select projects. We have partnered directly with the Housing Authority, the Department of Mental Health, and the Department of Health Services in the creation of permanent supportive housing. And one of the conversations that we have been engaged in for quite some time is to make it easier for developers to not have to go to multiple agencies to get funded, but to try to go to one place. Sure. In the past, we have done an online NOFA for permanent supportive housing, and we had HACLA, Department of Mental Health, Department of Health, and us all have one website, different pages, and you could apply for whatever combination of financing you needed. Because we created a pipeline in the city of Los Angeles, we upset that apple cart, and we are in conversations with those agencies to talk about them moving towards a pipeline model. There's benefits. We used to finance right at the tail end before tax credits. We've created a pipeline now, so we're looking at a 2-year development projects, and we think that model is better for a variety of reasons for the projects. But we continue to work together to make joint decisions for permanent supportive housing, which is different from the other groups that you've asked about. So shall I move on? Yes. So the other types of housing, we will also have, housing is generally divided up by income level. And you'll have, by income level, it'll be 30% of the area median income, which is an extremely low income. So homeless people fall into that category, but there are also extremely low income people who are not homeless. Some of those might include extremely low income families, extremely low income senior citizens. Senior citizens, for example, living on Social Security alone would fall into extremely low income. And so we produce housing for that group. We produce housing at 50% of area median income. That's the typical tax credit, what's categorized as low income. And that will also be for either households or for seniors. In some cases, we have projects that are mixed populations. So you'll have a project I can think of, that has family housing and permanent supportive housing. So some folks are combining populations within their projects. In fact, that's more common than not. Some projects are exclusively for families. Some projects are targeted. So every developer will come forward with a concept plan that may have a distinct target population. We have some limitations within the pipeline. We limit the number of senior projects out of a policy reason. The policy reason is because our funding at the state level for seniors is limited, and we don't want to fill our pipeline full of projects that cannot get funding. So we limit it to what we know can get funded. We have outside of the managed pipeline. So that's everything at 50% of AMI, or area median income and below, is what we have in our managed pipeline. And again, back of the napkin, generally speaking, the area median income for a family of 4 in Los Angeles is about $50,000. So we're talking about serving households at or below $25,000 a year for a family of 4. The other projects that we do are what we call 4% deals. Those can range. Those are typically 60% of AMI, and they can be mixed income, including market rate units. So those projects will serve slightly higher households. They are shallower subsidies, and if they are mixed income, we can sometimes take value from the market rate units and enable some affordability with a shallow subsidy that is in the form of a tax credit. I would add, lastly, we do a first-time homebuyer program that is primarily aimed at moderate income household, low and moderate income households, and it is a silent second down payment assistance program, and it provides up to $60,000 in a down payment assistance that is then attached to the property as a loan. A silent second trust deed that gets paid off upon sale or after the first is paid off.
And these area median incomes are families, the household income, or the individual, the per capita?
They can be both. Their area median incomes are broken down by family size as well as income category. So there's basically tables that are produced. And the HUD table and the state table are slightly different. So depending upon the source of funding that we're using, we're looking at different tables.
So this is tricky because if the area median income is 50,000, most estimates suggest that you can't get an apartment for that amount anywhere in LA. So so there's that, not for you to respond to, but to make a note of. Of all these categories, what would you say is the breakdown in percentages of what's in the pipeline?
I don't know all of the percentages. I'd have to go back and look at that. Approximately, I think approximately 43% are permanent supportive housing in the production currently. Everything else will be at generally around 50% of the area median income.
I know we want to hear from Miguel. I want to just a couple of things. You had mentioned this point, the neighborhood resistance. When I first took office, we have 3 parking lots right next to our field office that were queued up for 60 units, 80 units, 20, 40, 120. That was a well-designed project, and ironically, many of the people who come in here and lament about wanting more housing and affordability, very same people who, when it's in their neighborhood, $800, seek a claim, and 3 years later, I've got homeless people in the Northeast and housing that could have been built by now that would have housed them. Talk about some of that.
You're right. That is, it is a challenge, and I think that Los Angeles, at least our experience with the supportive housing pipeline, as well as the affordable housing pipeline, those serving families and those serving seniors, we have a very strong developer community that builds quality projects, I think, in terms of both architecture, financial ability, and management. I think we're really privileged as a city to have a great affordable housing developer community, but I hear repeatedly from them that they face opposition, and I'm often listening for what are folks doing to overcome that. And I think that does drive some of their location decisions.
Anything else, colleagues? Thank you so much. Obviously, we want to continue the conversation. This part is the hard, or I won't say harder. This is the longer-term response to homelessness, is to build housing, and this requires more discipline, more patience. Requires us to be a little more respectful of the long-term process that's involved in building a unit of housing. So we appreciate that and look forward to working with you. Before we hear from our CAO, we have some public comment. Special one. Wayne from Encino. Patricia McAllister.
Yes, I like these little formulas you have, 50% of median income. Well, just let's build one project in Malibu and one over there in Beverly Hills, and then we'll see 50% of the median income in the area who qualifies for housing. Because in the end, the only people that really get this housing are people plugged into the political system. It's all a scam. You go and you look at the tents around CD1, that's because the representative is telling the cops not to clean them out while they're conducting drug sales on the streets, because he understands that politically it makes good cover. You make it look like there's a tragedy going on when really you're just telling everybody to let it screw out into the open. So what you need to do is stop the politics, build the housing, and get the chronically homeless off the streets first. It's a real urgent issue.
I owe some of the council members, maybe this committee, an apology. Being kind of rough on you guys. From today's meeting and listening to this lady, you guys don't know what's going on. It's going to cost you your election. That's racism. I know for a fact, 1050 Wilshire, they had tax credits, HUD, and everything else. Once they got in there and got the affordable units, they kicked the people out in 9 months, raised their rent up to $2,000, changed it to 50%. How do I know I was one of the tenants? So don't tell me what's going on out there. It's all a game. It's a hustle. You guys got to get in that housing department, get those racists out of there, and run that department. It's going to cost you your election. Based on the questions that you had, you don't know. I know more what's going on than you do. Get in there and get her out of there and the rest of those racists out of there. A lot of stuff she told you, she's sugarcoating stuff. I could tell you more than what she told you that's going on out there. She's smiling. She knows I know what I'm talking about.
Amy Anderson and Stephanie Klasky-Garner.
Stephanie? Hi, I'm Amy Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of PATH Ventures. We are an affiliate of PATH, a homeless services organization, and a developer of permanent supportive housing. Very supportive of the motion before you today. And in the spirit of looking for solutions, I want to echo what Helmi told you about the effort to try and consolidate the resources into fewer sources. One of the challenges is the variety of funding sources that a developer needs to gather. The funding sources are only available at certain points in time, so we have to align when we're going and applying for different resources. And it's super competitive, so we don't always know we're going to get them. Another strategy to consider for permanent supportive housing is to be using the 4% state federal tax credit program instead of the 9%, because again, those resources are available all year long, basically over the counter. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Klasky-Gamer from LA Family Housing. And we have developments, when you talk about disbursement of permanent supportive housing and affordable units, we really have developments all over the city and in each of your districts. And I'm glad that you got to come out to CD6 and see our permanent supportive housing there. I wanted to address two things. One, also in support of this motion, but I want to address two things that were raised. One had to do with the NIMBY issue and neighborhood opposition. Where that matters primarily is discretionary approvals for land use, but also when we apply to the city for funding, for capital funding to build the building, we're required to submit a letter of approval from our city council office. And the city council office tends to tell us developers, go to the community and get their support before I can give you a letter of support. So we just have to make sure we know where the NIMBY problem, where it shows up. And not that it's a problem in and of itself. And all right, I'll go with that.
I have King Chung?
Wasn't explaining that fast. Mr. Chair, I put an item on this one.
Yes, you did. Why don't you come up?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is King Chung, co-chair of the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development. I'd like to address that we help the tenants in Chinatown and Highland Park and downtown area. And what we saw recently is that 20 units out of the loss will be lost in a few months. These are affordable housing, low-cost rent control housing a lot of developers coming in, buying up these low-cost rent control apartments and convert them into luxury apartments or rebuild them into like luxury units. So I like to ask that some kind of limit be placed on the Alice Act evictions, so that we don't lose all those low-cost housing for the people. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike Millman from Angla, Mar Vista. I'm one of the NIMBYs. I sit on the Plum Committee. Why don't we talk truth to power? 3,000 units in the pipeline. Angla's got 25,000 ready to go right now. We're bare knuckle, hard charging, good managers. We don't need caseworkers. We'll put your at-risk tenants in right now. All we need is an exemption from the RSO. That's 10,000 units that you don't have to pay 1 penny. My plan covers 15 council districts. 15 council districts. I'll put them in the Palisades. I'll put them in San Pedro. I'll put them in Westwood. I'll put them in Cheviot Hills. I'll put them in every district. My plan requires one thing only: courage. We don't even have our bootleg unit deal down from the 6th floor. So Merry Christmas. Come to the AGLA event on Friday night. I appreciate you letting me talk, but we are strapped and ready to go. We are not in a pipeline.
Thank you.
I also had a general one as well. Want me to
Okay,
do it
got
now
it.
or later?
And later.
Okay, thank you.
Just move the motion. Yeah. So let's move the motion and adopt not a report back, but follow-up to...
The information just be submitted to the council offices, the request of county and any other private, potentially private units on permanent supportive housing, both what exists and anything in the pipeline we may be aware of.
Okay. So moved.
Okay, voice vote. Cedillo.
Cedillo.
Fuentes.
Aye.
Rizar.
Aye.
Price.
Aye.
Harris Dawson. Thank you.
Okay. Adjourned? We adjourned the special? Move to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
You good?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That takes us to the regular meeting item number 2, the CAO report relative to the city's inventory available to homeless individuals.
Yes. Chair for a second.
Sure.
Come on up, Mr. Santana. The item before us is item number 2. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Miguel Santana, CAO. I asked Peter Lynn, Executive Director of LASA, to also join us in this presentation.
Good afternoon.
This report was done in collaboration with LASA, the CLA, and your offices to really ask a very fundamental question, and it's similar to the questions that you've been asking, and that is, what is the current funding gap based on the homeless count that we currently know of? And so it tries to look at the current capacity for housing for the homeless. It defines what that means. And I know there was a number of questions about the scale of housing that currently exists. We provide definitions to help provide some clarity. So the LASA specifically worked on an analysis that showed what the current capacity is for housing, specifically for homelessness, and what it needs to be if our goal was to try to house everyone we know to be homeless today. Then beyond that, it starts discussing a variety of other issues, including how do we pay for it. It lays out a series of recommendations on potential funding sources that your council can consider. And then it concludes asking a series of policy questions. Those questions help inform the the analysis and report that my office and the CLA are preparing at the direction of the Homeless and Poverty Committee to develop a comprehensive strategy around homelessness in coordination with the County of Los Angeles, as you indicated. We're on track of providing that report to the Homeless and Housing Committee in early January, with the goal that it goes before your full council in February, concurrent when the Board of Supervisors will hear it. It's important to also note that obviously homelessness is a very complicated issue that involves a number of solutions. It's impossible to talk about homelessness without discussing housing. It is our expectation and recommendation that elements of our comprehensive strategy that are specific to housing, like setting a housing policy, certain housing goals, funding for development of housing would obviously be presented before this committee. And concurrent to that, any issues pertaining to mental health services or health services would go to that committee. Any impacts to the general fund will ultimately go to Budget and Finance. But the report that we're preparing will be comprehensive. That will look at all of those issues and then be divided up based on the subject matter to ensure it gets input from all the respective committees as appropriate. So with that, we'll be happy to respond to any questions.
Mr. Fuentes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I feel particularly special. I think I'm the only member of this committee that's not on the Homelessness Committee. So I feel like this presentation is just for me. So I will try not to speak to some of the things that you've already spoke to in the Homeless Committee. I did listen, and I think a majority of my questions were answered. And so if I'm asking you to repeat something, please let me know, and I'll just go back and listen to the tape. But speak to me a little bit on the demand side of things in terms of the need. I know that the census is largely sort of built around, in order to understand what the need is, you have to go to the census of the count that we do, and it seems that it's January on a biannual basis, but we're moving to an annual basis. How I know that number is good based on our experience, yes, but relative to sort of best practices, how good is that number in terms of how other jurisdictions sort of understand what the real need is? Because I think before you speak to what the resources necessary to create the housing is going to be, we really have to get a real sense for what is the number. How confident are we that this is the best way for us to gauge the need and the demand?
I appreciate the question. So our count obviously takes into account the people who are in shelter. So we have a process for gathering all the information about the sheltered population on any given night, some of which is funded by public monies, some of which is private. But we also do an actual census out in the community. We found out this last time we covered 90% of the census tracts across the county. Our methodology is best practice. We have good feedback from HUD and from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness on the methodology, the methodological strength of it. It is an estimate, obviously. It is not as though we are required to come out with a final number, and it has it's down to the single digits. But it's important to recognize that there is a margin of error in that. But it is within the range of the way such counts are conducted nationally. One challenge we have locally is the very, very high percentage of our population that is unsheltered and requires a count out in the field. One, challenge within that is that many of the majority of that population are actually in some kind of dwelling structure. A lot of people are living in vehicles. A lot of people are living in tents and other makeshift shelters. So we have to make some allowances for estimates of the population in those structures as we count. All of that combined, though, gives us a very robust estimate that is consistent with, national best practice of estimating this population. But it is important to recognize that it's an estimate. It's really important to look at the direction of the movement. Is it going up or down? And one of the other things that we work on, not in association with the census or the count, which, as you pointed out, is going to be conducted on an annual basis, are estimates of inflow. How many people are falling into homelessness at any given time? And part of that goes into this model and sort of estimating what the demand, not on tonight will be, but projected out across the course of a year.
I ask because I think that, we probably, if we're within the variability in our number, then that's okay. Irrespective of what the number is, it's a daunting sort of task ahead of us. But I think it's important for us to sort of understand what sort of the inflows and outflows look like. I just wonder out loud if our census or your sort of coordinated work in counting these folks accounts for what I think are particularly unique situations in the city, whether it's the Tahunga Wash, whether it's the Sepulveda Basin, Hanson Dam, the Los Angeles River. There seems to be these enclaves that, at least from my anecdotal perspective, are largely missed because they're not the RV or the underpass and that sort of thing. So I just wonder if there is any special sort of outreach planned to begin to sort of account for that, one. And then two, as much as I understand that it's a resource issue, I almost think that we have to do this on a quarterly basis if we're going to be honest about the emergency that we have before us. Maybe it's twice a year, but my point is that I don't know how it is that we demonstrate a move in the needle if we can't, maybe based on spa service provider areas, sort of understand how much of an impact we're actually having over time. And so I ask all of that not to have an answer today, but just we're going to have to figure out how to measure success versus just managing the situation. And so I don't know if you've got any thoughts along those lines.
Well, I mean, your question and observations have a number of different facets to them. I think that measuring the metrics of success are that's a critical component to our moving forward. We need to know whether we're making progress toward a goal, and we need continuous feedback on that. Obviously, one of the aspects of it that we can measure are housing placements and people that have been engaged, and as we're moving things through the pipeline. So, for example, on the veteran side, we can look at people who are newly impacting our emergency housing system, whether they're showing up for the first time in an outreach encounter, in a shelter setting, in one of our transitional housing centers. We have the most robust set of data on the veterans right now. And as we watch the progress of those bars decrease month by month, we can show that new contacts with folks are actually decreasing, and it is actually having a population impact on the street. Building out a similar set of metrics for the general population, single adults, and is a much more challenging task, as you rightly pointed out. And I think that daunting is a good word for the idea of doing a quarterly count. I mean, it is a very expensive and labor-intensive proposition. I think I really appreciate the challenge to us about what would be appropriate metrics and coming back to that. On your first point with regard to outreach in the really challenging areas and ensuring that those areas get counted, we did assign so we don't usually put volunteer enumerators to those really, really tough areas. Right. I mean, there's some pretty hairy ones, and there's some that are pretty off the grid. So we put LASA, ERT, and other robust outreach staff to count in areas that are really off the grid there. We have also, in preparation for El Nino and trying to make sure that people are out of danger and have been alerted to the dangers of the flood path, have been walking the river and all the way out through the washes from San Pedro, all the way up into Tonga, and making sure that everybody has a good sense of that. What we're doing at the same time, in conjunction with the Sheriff's Department, in conjunction with Public Works and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and a lot of other folks who are out there, mapping that, right? So we have a really good comprehensive set of encampment maps along that which is going to serve to inform the way that we're conducting the enumeration. I think it's going to help a lot, as well as the increased staff that we have for outreach.
If I could also add, central to sort of the strategy that we're developing is a way to help people enter into a system, right? So, in the Homeless and Poverty Committee, there's been a discussion around the value of having the coordinated entry system, whose the sole purpose is to literally identify every single homeless individual, assess their needs, and attach another human being to them, so that in real time there is an ongoing effort to try to move that person into housing depending on their particular needs and connect them to resources. It sounds almost impossible to do when you have such a large population, but it's a critical piece of this program because if it's done right, if every homeless individual is entered into that system, even if it's a nominal entry, right, because the person refuses to participate or whatever way, then we have an ability to then assess on an ongoing basis sort of what the need is and what the capacity is. Now, of course, making that identification is only the beginning because it's not helpful if now you know who that person is, you know what their needs are, and you have nowhere to place them, right? And so building the capacity of housing has to be concurrent to building that infrastructure of case management so that there's an ongoing effort and interventions to sometimes convince that person into housing while at the same time making sure that that capacity exists. And as part of the report, we talk about the various kinds of housing that should be available, particularly around establishing a much more aggressive voucher program to immediately place people into housing, particularly as if the city moves forward in a robust program around building bricks and mortar, right? That's not going to happen, as you all talked about. That's not going to happen overnight. There's going to take time to put that together. So there has to be something in between. And so what day one looks like is very different from year 5, year 10.
And I just wanted to be clear, I didn't want to suggest that the census would be sort of the only rubric by which we measure success. I mean, I think you have to contextualize what your count is and contrast that with sort of your uptake in housing, resources, et cetera. But Mr. Santana, you lead us to sort of the question that I've got, and I understand that we have to charge hard on all of these areas, on the count, on what it is the coordinated entry system looks like, what production of housing looks like, and then sort of the grab bag of everything else. So once we've sort of, in ideal situations, we've communicated in contact with somebody, I'm beginning to get a little concerned about what the coordinated entry system looks like today. You've got 3 iterations of it. It's not a digitized platform yet. Is it digitized now?
That's correct. It's all on HMIS, which is the backbone of the
Okay, so I'm confused about that. So how new is that? Spend a little time with that, because when I read the report, there are 3 iterations of that system. And to me, anytime you speak to systems and integration, it makes me very, very nervous, because I think that we will founder a little bit if we don't have a platform that is stable, that is ubiquitous to everybody who's working on this issue.
Well, I appreciate the question. So the Homeless Family Solution System was the first build-out in our HMIS platform. So that is a coordinated entry system for families. It has because families present to the crisis system in a different way than many of the single adults and also the transition age youth, there is a front end that presents to them that is different from the front end that presents to the single adult system. And so they were built as separate systems, but we are integrating them behind the scenes within HMIS. So we participated both as LASA and in my old position as HACLA in the initial build out of the coordinated entry system, which was on a different data structure. It has since been migrated into HMIS, and candidly, that was a challenge. It was a painful process, and we're not quite there yet. But we have migrated. We have about a quarter of the population within the current HMIS backbone. So it's more than 10,000 individuals have been surveyed. They've been assessed. We can track their progress. Certain features are not fully implemented, so there's an ongoing development. We're working with our vendor. We are working with the population, the provider population, as to exactly how that is. But it is, the backbone of it is on HMIS, and we're continuing to roll that out. In addition, there is a pilot to build out a similar infrastructure using the best practices from both of those earlier systems with an eye toward full integration in the back end for youth. So that's in process right now. But the intent is to have a common platform, and that it may present to these populations differently because they show up differently. There are different funding streams. There are largely different providers. Even providers who serve multiple populations deal with them differently. But the intent is to have a number of common elements so that we're using a common assessment tool and everybody has the same scorecard for acuity, that we're on the same data platform and that we can pull reports cross-population and aggregate those data, and that we have a similar strategy for addressing people who refuse to be assessed and still need to be dealt with in some way, for provider entry into the system. And so there is a commonality there, and our intent is to have a systematic infrastructure that is common to all populations.
So today, any sort of service provider would have the ability to look up. In my ideal world, when I confront, not confront, when I approach somebody, will I be able to sort of look them up immediately and understand that Felipe was at this corner today, and last time we saw him, he was on this corner? Because to me, the innovation piece of this has a tremendous amount of potential to really map and quickly assess versus having to go back to HQ and sort of see what it was that I encountered in a visit earlier. I mean, are we there today?
Right. So there's a number of different pieces to what you talked about. One of them is putting technology in the hands of outreach workers who are in the field. We have our ERT folks have tablets that interface with HMIS right now. There is a module that tracks outreach encounters. That is sort of in front of the assessment component of the coordinated entry system. There are a lot of folks who are not yet using that yet, so there's a rollout of sort of every touch and every encounter being captured. That's a different, at this point what's being caught are more engagements where we're doing an assessment, and that assessment data is captured, and then a trajectory of their encounters from there.
Sure.
But you could look someone up and find them, and the intent is to move toward that kind of data structure.
And I guess sort of it's an order of priority. I mean, probably what is most important to know is to understand if you're dealing with a 1 or a 4 in acuity, yes, and then everything else. But to me, there would be so much benefit if there was a way to understand by geocoding the encounter, sort of understanding in real time what you're dealing with. Maybe that will shorten the distance between sort of somebody accepting or rejecting our help because we've got it in real time. And I know that's sort of terribly ideal, but to me it seems like speed's going to be what's going to be tremendously helpful here.
I think you're really right on, and I think that part of there are a number of different pieces to the enrichment of that encounter. Are we capturing the data? But the other piece of it is, which I think Miguel was flagging, was the authenticity of our value proposition to that person. Do we have the crisis housing intervention that we can put them into immediately while we're navigating them to a robust housing outcome? And where we have gaps in that infrastructure, we don't have the same depth of value to offer someone. And so that's where I think we need to reinvigorate the entire system, convert each piece so that there is flow through the model. I think that's one of the things that this model highlights. You can see on there that there's a projected number of sort of shelter beds, but that projection is based on the expectation that those beds are driving toward outcomes, that there is a link that clearly through that process they are navigated to a housing outcome, and that there's a turnover on the beds that's based on that kind of flow. Those are all elements of the system that we need to be able to build out, and it's kind of building them all in parallel at the same time. I think the data system is very, very important. And we're testing that out with our own systems at LASA, our own outreach module, and putting tablets in the hands of our staff so that we have something that's quite robust for all folks to go to. There's a lot of different working parts.
If I could just add, I think there's an acknowledgement that we're not there yet in terms of having the kind of system that you just described, that in the investment that the city's making in the current fiscal year, based on the motion Mr. Weiser introduced, it's to strengthen that the flexibility of that system, make it more relevant in real time. I was recently in Washington meeting with HUD, and I asked specifically the office around homelessness, is there a sort of a national model of coordinated entry system that we could turn to say, we want to duplicate what X city is doing, and they actually said there isn't. And in some ways, we're kind of creating it in real time. And that was not the answer I was hoping for. I was hoping they could say, just go to Portland and they have exactly what you're looking for. But I think what is clear is that something like that needs to be strengthened, and it's the starting point of a process that leads to permanent housing.
So, and I think the report helps me understand the host, or rather the range of options when it comes to resources, and it's not going to be an easy, I think, sort of follow-up to figure out how it is that we pay for all of this. But notwithstanding that challenge, there's one thing that I don't think is sort of in here that I think, for better or for worse, is probably a little controversial to talk about out loud, and I just feel like it hasn't been spoken about yet. But at what point, so there's a lot of faces to sort of the encounters that we have out there. But in my opinion, sort of what keeps people in the resistance mode from all of this is addiction. And I just wonder out loud, in terms of sort of, I know you've got emergency shelter and transitional and permanent supportive and the 4 categories here, but what category is available to us within the law to assert our ability to say to somebody that they present a danger to themselves immediately, so that we could try to figure out how to intervene in a more aggressive kind of way. And I say it's controversial because I don't think any one of us wants to force anybody into a situation, but I think, at least in my very anecdotal experience in my district, there are a lot of situations there that need a little bit more than just the offer. And I wonder if your report will speak to that, or our conversations with the county. Is there a way for us to compel somebody in for a little bit of time to try to figure out how to at least triage their immediate situation, and whether they take the services thereafter or not is another thing. But is that component being contemplated, talked about, potentially reported on in the near future?
Well, specifically as it relates to programs for those who suffer from addiction or severe
illness,
mental health challenges, the county is strengthening the infrastructure of available housing and beds, particularly for that population, due to an infusion of both federal dollars and state dollars. But the specific question you're asking about is almost on an involuntary basis, which becomes much more challenging. Someone needs to present a clear danger to themselves or to others for there to be something much more aggressive than that. And oftentimes the solutions are very temporary. It's simply to stabilize them, and so that danger doesn't exist. What the county health department is moving towards is tying healthcare dollars around housing, because their argument is that it's impossible to treat somebody if they're homeless, because the very element of being outside in the elements makes their treatment very difficult. And so they've been very creative in utilizing federal healthcare dollars to provide housing opportunities for people, both for the well-being of that individual, but also because it's more cost-effective for them, particularly with those folks who are the frequent flyers of the emergency room,
Level 4s,
which is the most expensive care that the county provides. And so the county is moving in that direction. And again, under those contexts, it's still on a voluntary basis. The specific question that you're raising really would involve state and federal law to bring, greater clarity on that point.
I just wonder if there's something short of a 5150 hold that we can do from a law enforcement perspective to say that this is a situation that necessitates this type of clinical intervention. Maybe it's not a 72-hour hold. Maybe it's something else. But I just feel like that piece is something that, at least in my district, is one that we could do all of this right, and I don't know that we address that particular situation.
Well, one of the questions that we raise in our report is the concept of housing first. And housing first is not just a strategy, in that the idea is that folks should be placed in housing regardless of any expectations of recovery or mental health treatment, that the housing will be made available. And then once they're in housing, then the goal is that over time they'll start dealing with some of those issues that contributed to their homelessness. But it's also a philosophy of doing whatever it takes. It's using whatever resources and frequent and constant engagement with someone to ensure that when they're ready, that they'll be prepared to take the offer. And so it's both of those things concurrent. So it's the expectation that at some point someone may say, okay, today's the day that I'm going to say yes, and that there's a placement available for them. So it's a very aggressive but compassionate process to do that. It requires intensive case management, but not impossible.
Great. I should have begun with this. Thank you very much for what you're endeavoring to do here. Thanks.
I still don't think that's an excellent question on the substance abuse, substance dependent community, that our ability to intervene, the limits on it are very modest. And it's a whole societal discussion, not just the substance abuse, but the mental illness and then the dual diagnosis. The whole conversation there might have to be revisited for us to match them up, right, so that we get the match. I'm interested. This is compelling and very interesting, but I know you have a question, but I want to get into a discussion about the bricks and mortar part, what you called a robust offer. Strategies just on that piece. What are the things that we need to do? That's much of this discussion is more in the purview of the homeless committee, but for this committee, the real discussion is about how do we move to create the bricks and mortar. What are the needs, and what are the steps that we need to take? What's the first step we need to take to move in that direction?
Well,
you want to come up? How's you want to come up and give us also?
That's appropriate for the housing department to speak to, because it really is uniquely a housing issue, and that should be in the purview of this committee, and understanding what's required to build that capacity. And I think as Helmi started saying earlier, it does require sort of a strategy, a plan with a set of objectives, a commitment that it's going to be applied throughout the city, not just in one area. The latest HUD regulations actually mandate it. They mandate that there be decentralization and penalized jurisdictions who concentrate their affordable housing only in one section of the city or the region, and it requires funding. And in our report, we lay out a number of different potential funding sources for that, but building the trust fund that has been utilized in the past, and then as to the role of the city is knowing how to leverage the investment the city makes with what you call it, a cake that's layered, right. So to draw down county, state, private investment, and so it maximizes sort of that initial investment.
Yes, regarding the bricks and mortar development, I mean, I think the housing supply is one of the fundamental questions on housing across the city. And I think there is a distinction between permanent supportive housing, the bricks and mortar strategy that is serving homeless, and I think we have all generally agreed that the new development of permanent supportive housing is targeted to chronically homeless, a very specific subset of the entire homeless population, and there are other housing strategies for the broader homeless community. So the bricks and mortar strategy on permanent supportive housing is specifically to link the city and the county, the housing and the services funding, together with rent subsidies through either HACLA or the Department of Health, but to have a strategy that links those sources of funding and makes them available in a combined way. Separate from that, and I think what you'll see in the housing element of the city is there's a huge demand for affordable housing in addition to permanent supportive housing for the homeless, that we need to pursue simultaneously. So we need to pursue a housing strategy, a bricks and mortar strategy for low-income people that are at risk of homelessness, because there is such a demand for affordable housing. And I think those two capital strategies, right now, they're sort of linked. However, they could, in fact, be almost two separate pipelines. I think we treat our permanent supportive housing pipeline, we look at it differently because of its relationship to the rental subsidy and the service funding. It also goes after a separate tax credit allocation from the state. So the state, in terms of tax credits, we have a geographic apportionment of tax credits, which is generally used for low-income housing. There is a separate statewide pool for nonprofit and special needs housing. Our permanent supportive housing applies and competes at the statewide level for those set-asides. If, for example, we had a city-county allocation of special needs tax credits, that would help the city and county pursue a capital strategy for permanent supportive housing. Same thing with the Housing Authority and the Department of Mental Health. I think if we had a single NOFA or a single pipeline that combined rent subsidies, capital dollars, and service funding, and developers could apply at one time for all of those, that would help our capital system, ideally combined with this tax credit allocation for special needs. If we could make the funding flows simpler and more straightforward for permanent supportive housing, that would make that piece of development move faster. And of course, as it goes without saying, but we need to say it, is that we need more capital across the board. Any source of funding that we can bring to increase capital development, a linkage fee, any source of funding that we can bring into the city, a permanent source for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund would be able to be shared by both a permanent supportive housing strategy as well as the other affordable housing strategy.
How much capital?
I think that, it depends on how we want to pursue it. And I am, I think.
It's a scary number.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually not that scared of it. Well, okay, I'll jump right in. I would say that we should be taught. Well, I think it's quite possible to get there. I think it is important for us to really address it. I think we're talking $1 billion to get to a housing strategy to make a dent, particularly around the homelessness question, but to make a dent that is measurable and understandable. I think we are at this point, and have been for years, sort of running to keep up, and we are going to have to be talking about a very large funding source.
Mr. Chair.
Us who come from Sacramento, those numbers don't bother us.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Yes.
except when you don't have it, and we
California, though.
we $26 billion out of budget while I was appropriations chair, and it's not found its way back to municipal government yet, despite the fact that they're in the black. But
That's right.
I digress. Just a quick question, though. This is honestly a policy question, and I just wonder out loud. I understand that we have to go full steam ahead on all of it, affordable housing as well as permanent supportive housings and all the iterations of permanent supportive housing. Why not just pick affordable housing? Pick one, because it seems to me that we're not going to get the $1 billion anytime soon. And it's such a disparate, well, I shouldn't say that. I know that it really makes an impact on a few lives, many more than a few lives, when we do it all. But it's, from a policy perspective, it seems like such a disparate effect to try to do it all. So why not just focus all of our energy on affordable housing, hoping that it would alleviate some of the sort of movement into homelessness and or maybe pull people back out of it. Why not just pick one and do it all so that we have a larger effect immediately? And it's honestly just a policy question. Has that been done in other places where the strategy has been pick one and it seemed to alleviate some of the challenges and other elements of the housing crisis? Or is this completely uncharted water, Los Angeles?
It's not completely uncharted water, and I think that the housing developer and housing policy community in Los Angeles does discuss this all the time. I think on homelessness in particular, the model of permanent supportive housing, which is housing with wraparound services, nationally has been shown to be best practices for really serving the needs of chronically homeless individuals. So I think that there has been a need for that.
No, I understand that, but I mean, in terms, if we're going to try to do it all, which we have to address, are we not better just suited picking one category and spending 5 years on it?
I would tell you that one of the reasons that I think it doesn't make sense to pick and choose is because the capital doesn't pick and choose. Capital comes in various forms. All of these projects are financed differently. So there isn't just one source of capital that just does one type of housing. There's actually a variety of sources of capital that look for different structures. So there's shallower subsidies and deeper subsidies. There's housing money that's targeted to specific populations and some that's not. So part of what we're always trying to do is both address a policy question and also address a math question.
Right.
But let me just sharpen a little bit, because the money doesn't automatically come that way. Human beings make decisions about what the money does.
Right.
If human beings were to make the decision that the capital is going to be focused on strategy X,
Right.
would that be more helpful to you or less helpful?
The human beings that make those decisions reside in so many different places. So you have city deciders, you have county deciders, you have state deciders, you have federal deciders, you have private sector deciders, and you have philanthropic deciders. So all of these parties that are participating in these decisions are looking for different policy objectives. And it's not like there's one common theme. There are sort of what we would call within the housing community some themes that have developed. So there are certain types of capital flows that sort of organize themselves to achieve certain outcomes.
I think
So I understand that clearly. But my question is, say there was a really good organizer that could organize all these individuals, right? And let's say Helmy walks in the room, gets them all on the same page, and says, let's direct capital in this way. Would that be more helpful to you than the situation we have now, or less?
But you can do that, and I mean, as a city council, because if there's a discussion and a commitment to create a pool of funding for investment, then you are now in some ways shaping the market, because you're setting expectations around who comes to the table and in what form. And second, it's not just about dollars, it's about property. The city sits on a lot of property in this town that's underutilized, parking lots and facilities that are not necessarily most conducive to a community, that could be converted to opportunities for housing or other kinds of mixed-use development. So suddenly the city is in the business of saying we are willing to be an investor in creating capacity. This is what we want to see in collaboration with the community, so that it's in many cases what HUD is requiring, that be as mixed as possible in relation to affordable, people with special needs, the disabled, other communities, and spread around the city. So it's if we start seeing ourselves as investors in helping build that capacity and then building the consensus, then you do have a seat in the table, a very important seat, probably the biggest seat in being able to influence the outcome. But specifically to your question, our recommendation that it be that you start off understanding what the need is comprehensively, right? And this report made an attempt to do that, knowing that the number is daunting, right? Because whatever investment that you choose to make, the question you're going to ask is, how much do I move the needle, right? But you have to have a baseline to understand what the need is. That's constantly evaluated on an annual basis to redirect that investment based on whatever new information you have. And so that's where we're hoping to end up, knowing that it may take 10 years to get there, it may take 20 years, we may never get there. But I think what's clear by the focus of your committee, the focus of the Homeless and Poverty Committee, the council as a whole, is that the status quo is not acceptable anymore, and there's a willingness to start at least making an effort to get there.
So to that point, I mean, I think where I was trying to tease out to is when we get to the decision point, let's just say hypothetically it's the linkage fee, and let's say hypothetically it's the $112 million, on the high end of what you're suggesting might be possible. My desire, at least at this point, would be to want to use it all towards one sort of goal, and try to figure out how to move away from a maintenance of effort situation, which is what it feels like we're doing today in our housing strategy. And I don't mean that disparagingly. I know that we're doing good things, but it feels like a maintenance of effort versus a sort of solution-driven effort. And I think there's a distinction there. And so, I'm eagerly anticipating what the report recommendation is going to be, but to me it seems that that's sort of the way to do it, is to just absolutely dedicate whatever source of resources completely and wholly to strategy X and keep it out of the general fund and really lockbox it, really try to do something like that.
Strategic target.
I think that the strategic target in unit counts is different than the strategic target with money. And having done a lot of development throughout my career, the more we put the strings on the money, the less efficient we are with money. And I think the more clear we are about targets and hitting targets, the better outcomes we have.
That makes sense.
All right. I mean, some of this the reality, it's, war or a fight, everything, as soon as you hit the ground, it all changes, right? So our realities may not afford us the luxuries of being that strategic, right?
Could I just throw one observation? I keep wanting to come back and reiterate one important concept, which is that bricks and mortar obviously is an important part. We have a housing stock problem as much as anything, but it is not the only requirement for permanent supportive housing. Most of the permanent supportive housing that is deployed in the city and in the county is actually a rental subsidy with the services. It has nothing to do with a site or a building of a location or any of those kinds of things. So it's really important to recognize that there's a mix of different kinds of deployment strategies here, and most of what we do is actually just a tenant-based rental subsidy, generally federal, combined with a deep, rich offering of supportive services.
Yeah, no, we got that. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, Mr. Price.
Yeah, just a question. I
Right over there.
don't want to digress, but on this issue of bricks and mortar, or maybe lath and plaster, might be a little more appropriate. Motels. We've got an inventory of motels. Some abandoned, some need to be abandoned. Some, could perhaps be repurposed, or could they? I mean, do motels lend themselves to a temporary or permanent solution that can have any real consequence in some of our neighborhoods?
You want to answer? I mean,
You could do the rehab part.
yeah, I think that is a good strategy. We haven't currently got an inventory of hotels or motels that would be available for that, but I think that housing that would be convertible, could be convertible to housing, and could be from a cost perspective, it is generally cheaper to rehab a building than to build a new one. So yes, that's a good approach.
But it has not been part of our strategy to date.
Has not been part of our current strategy.
We have occasionally redeveloped what was a hotel or a motel into permanent supportive housing. It has been done. It's
kind of only as it came on the market, though, or if it's just been sitting around
right,
for 10 years
would go after a
sometimes.
particular site. I mean, we also use motels as part of the crisis housing inventory for deployment of people, pulling them immediately out of a situation. So there's some use there, and I also recognize that some motels have challenging relationships with their neighborhood, so there could be an additive effect of changing the way they operated.
Go ahead, and then I've got
Thank
a
you.
question I'm going to ask.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to the issue that my colleague, Councilmember Fuentes, raised about hard to place people, especially because of mental health conditions. Among mental health conditions, addiction being one of the most vexing ones. I wanted to let everybody know, under the sound of our voice, on the 9th of December, we'll be having a joint committee with homelessness and poverty, along with mental health, which I think you're not on. You're invited, so we want you to be there because we really want to unpack the question about the people that refuse services, because I think there's a range of issues, among them addiction being one of them. But what will be an interesting question for me, and Peter, I'm officially asking you to be a part of the panel that day. One of the questions that we want to ask is, addiction is not new, but the level of homelessness we have is, right? Mental health conditions are not new. I mean, the DSM comes out every 3 years, 4, I've forgotten. It's been a long time since I took that class. But, I mean, as far as I know, they aren't coming out with new conditions that say, if you have this condition, you don't want to live indoors. I think it'll be an opportunity for us to have a robust discussion with mental health experts that can give us some window into this problem, because I have encountered exactly what Councilmember Fuentes is talking about. On the other hand, I've also encountered you find a placement for somebody and you go with them to the placement and you go, oh, I get why you want to refuse this. And why you'd rather sleep at the beach than here. So I think we just want to unpack that and see if we can't get a scientific look at what's actually happening with people and sort of take away some of the mystery. Because for me, as a layman, it's always very, very confusing why a person would be under the freeway and say, no, I won't go with you to get housing.
I hear the concept of service resistance, refusal to accept housing, refusal to accept services. I hear that a lot, and I really struggle with the validity of the concept in general. I think there's a couple of things that are going on. One is, like I said before, what I think we need to question ourselves about is the authenticity of the proposition we're offering people. Did we meet them where they're at? Did we meet them on an actual trust basis? Did we engage them in a way that could be heard and read as trust? I mean, often you're dealing with people who from very youngest ages have been battered, have been treated abominably. Their trust in folks has been just completely battered. And what we have offered over the years has not been a consistent, truthful proposition that we are going to, bring them through into a solid, safe housing arrangement. Do we have a solid, safe place for them to go while they're being navigated through that? I think until all of those things are true, and that we have done each of our parts to actually make a true proposition of each step in that, I don't think you can tell me that the person is service resistant. I can understand that they didn't accept that offer, but I don't know that we gave them a valid offer. And I feel like it's incredibly presumptuous of us to point the finger at the person who is at the receiving end of decades of neglect and abuse and betrayal and broken promises of assistance, and then say, well, I tried to give them something and they didn't go. I feel like it's really incumbent on us to build out the infrastructure that actually makes good on the premise that we can place these folks into housing in a caring, loving, consistent way, and then we get an opportunity to say that they're resistant. And it may well turn out that there are people who have serious, severe mental health challenges on the street who would fall into that category, and then we have to meet them in a different way. And we do have tools. We have Laura's Law. We have other kinds of tools, and we need to use those right. We do have in the face of us a drug Medi-Cal waiver that is going to really change the way that we can deliver drug addiction and substance abuse treatment services to people. And that, I think, is, we're sort of on the cusp of being able to deliver that. It's not really going to come through until next summer, but there's tremendous capacity there to push substance abuse treatment out in ways that we have never really been able to do. But I suspect that the challenge of service resistance largely is based on the offering that we've made and, the lack of authenticity to it.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you on the 9th.
I appreciate that. Let me, from a housing committee perspective, less from the homeless committee, the question for many who are here today about the impact of loss of beds from HUD's policy change to focus on rapid rehousing and to defund transitional housing. When will this occur? How fast will we lose beds? And is there anything we can do to prevent or provide bridge funding? Wouldn't this be a better use or a good use of resources available?
I appreciate the opportunity
There are people here who want
to speak to this. So just to give a quick overview, HUD Funds, at the last renewal that we just applied for was $110 million. Some of that was new money, but HUD Funds an enormous portfolio of rental assistance and other kinds of programs throughout the county of Los Angeles. They have, over the past decade, signaled that they are consistent in shifting funding from older models like transitional housing and services-only grants to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing grants. They have done that in a number of different ways, bonus points. They have done it in policy direction. They've given a lot of guidance. They have also undervalued those proposals that come forward with transitional housing. So they took a very dramatic step in our last renewal process of basically they put 15% of our portfolio, which is about 14 million in that renewal only, in a category that was at very, very high risk if you didn't propose permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. And we had greater than that in terms of our services only and transitional portfolio. So basically, to the extent that we put it in that category, we would just lose all those funds. They have done that before. They're very happy to reallocate away from us and give it to municipalities that choose to do what they've asked us to do. So we had essentially no choice but to take this action. What it put together was a portfolio of about 1,100 rapid rehousing units and about 631 permanent supportive housing units that we bid on in new projects. It's 32 different projects across the county. What it took away was nearly 60 transitional and services only categories. And among the transitional housing programs, that's close to 2,000 beds. It's a very significant piece of our infrastructure. Our first priority was to, kind of accomplish the goal of getting that submitted and to HUD. Immediately following that, we began to work through that portfolio. We have been calling each of the providers that are impacted by those funding allocation decisions, and they don't fall on a given date. They basically start to roll in at the expiration of each of those contracts, which are dispersed around the year, which, the good news is that it gives us a natural, sort of priority list of how to go after working with them. We also worked with a number of different funders in our municipality and the city and the county, funders like the Department of Health Services, Department of Mental Health, the Veterans Affairs, the federal VA, our own crisis housing programs through LASA, and a number of different funders who have an appetite for crisis housing beds of various kinds. So transitional, notwithstanding, the transitional component it's basically a services layer on top of a shelter program. But this would be additional shelter programming that would fund interim beds, maybe through the VA, maybe through our family's crisis system, maybe through DMH's crisis system, through DHS's crisis system. So we're gathering up funders. We are contacting each of the impacted providers to say, okay, here's what's happening, here's the dates, what kinds of funding and programming would you be interested in? This is the menu of things that we've been able to put together, or what are you interested in cobbling together? And part of what we're trying to do is ensure that, as these programs get to the end of their grants and they start to, be in the position of they're going to have to shut their doors, that they don't stop taking new people and leave an empty bed, but we come up with a new funding source and essentially checkerboard those people in with a different funding source. So it's a complex undertaking, but my staff have fanned out across this portfolio to ensure that we don't lose this inventory and we don't have an empty bed, and we're continuously engaging with the providers and figuring out ways that we're going to put the people who are in those units into a permanent housing outcome.
Mr. Chair, I have to apologize. I have to go start my committee. Excuse me.
We've got, so you're confident that we won't lose a bed?
I didn't say that. We're going to make a really hard run at not doing that, and obviously funding is the key variable. So we will be putting together within this portfolio and looking at different funders and their appetites for paying for beds. We think we can cover a good chunk of that portfolio. There may be an ask that we come back to the city and the county that says, okay, here's a portfolio that would be good bridge housing connected with a coordinated entry system that will help facilitate the rest of this process, and this is a good infrastructure investment for the next few years, and then we can figure it out later as we get to, as we move through some of the housing that we need to do.
Just my own personal. It just seems to me that we, since I've been here, all I get is HUD going in new directions or being punitive to the city for actions that were taken during a really difficult time period for the city, 07, 08, 09, 010. And all HUD keeps giving us is bad choices. And do you have any thoughts on how we can get them to change that? I mean, you would think with a Democratic president and such a robust commitment that somehow that we could get some favor from them.
I don't
some deference to what we do.
I don't disagree with that. I will observe that not in this funding cycle, but in the last application, there was a very clear sort of leg up that they gave us, right? So the targeting that they gave bonus points for areas in high need. They gave bonus points for areas that had committed to a coordinated entry system, and HACLA actually won a $10.2 million grant, the largest single one that they'd ever awarded, 550 units. So that was last year. This year they kind of reversed themselves along the lines of what you're saying. There was no targeting for need. It was all targeting on municipalities that have reduced their homeless counts, and so we have to continuously engage with them. Now, that may relate to other factors that are outside our purview. Maybe they needed to swing the pendulum the other way because they gave us so much the year before or something like that. We need to continuously engage, continuously articulate the needs of Los Angeles at all levels. And I think we're committed to that, and I know that the leadership here is as well.
We have public comment. B. Stoutzer, you want to come up? And Jesse Needham, Pilad. Jesse Needham. What about Nick Grief? B.
Thank you, Mr. Councilman, Mr. Chairman. And for a little bit of added time, I know we're all short on time. A little bit of a context, I am a board member of New Economics for Women. I was asked at the last minute to come and speak to you about this issue. It's very complex regarding LASA's cut of 58 agencies and approximately $14 million worth of funding that is going to, now I find out that it's going to be about 2,000 units, but actually I think it's going to be more. We are very fortunate to have started a program in 1995 that serves single teen mothers. It's 60 units. It serves about 230 beds a year have always been outstanding outcomes with HUD. However, because of this new priority under HUD, we were one of the 58 that was told that we would no longer be getting the continuum of care funding. We house families. We do not house single individuals, and I think that there's a difference between both things. It was wonderful to hear the discussion today because income outcomes as well as housing outcomes are very tied based on affordability. What we got from HACLA was $158,000, of which helps subsidize about $200,000 worth of loss, since our women can only pay $300 a month of rent. That being said, the board met and recognized that we will have to turn over the keys to the city or be able to find a $200,000 gap in funding somehow. No guarantee from LASA that they would even be able to help us yet. So with that context, I wanted to provide to you some of the options that I think might happen, might have you as a city be able to consider. One, if we turn over the situation and we own the fact that we can't do the subsidize ourselves, nor can the tenants even be able to do any kind of housing, since the average income for many of our women are less than $9,000 a month.
A year.
A year, excuse me. A year. They pay $300 a month for rent. So even if we turned over the building to you, you have almost $8 million worth of debt on it, that's city, and we just got it appraised, and it's appraised less than $2 million. So we can't even get enough funding to rehab the building in order to reconvert it and transition it into permanent housing, even if we wanted to, even if you wanted to. So there has to be a reconsideration of debt and a reconsideration of its purpose if it's going to continue to be unaffordable. The other thing I would like to speak to is to have you consider adopting a policy by which to allow the city to really restructure the debt and look at managing and identifying the kind of capital that you might be able to manage in order to buy the loans, have us be able to buy out the loans if we could, and be able to really understand how you can continue with the covenants long term. Because what happens is the reason why it's less than $2 million is because the affordability covenants that the city has put on the land. So you have to have that kind of guarantee if we even turn that over to you and say it just can't work. We're hoping that that will not be true. On the long-term basis, I think that the losing of transitional housing for families is very different than transitional housing for single adults. We have been the only agency that has done so for the last 18 years, and hopefully we will continue to do so with your support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pilad.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Pilar Buelna, and I'm the Executive Director for Salvation Army Social Services. And for close to 20 years, we've been running transitional housing as well, very successfully for veterans, single families, single individuals, and so of course we're very devastated because of this reallocation of funding. But I think more importantly is we're concerned that there's really no clarity in terms of how we're going to transition. I mean, I heard LASA speak to, we're going to look for funding and all that, and it might be too soon kind of to really have that expectation. But, when we're talking about losing 2,000 beds, 500 of which will come from the Salvation Army, that's really concerning to us. And because we need to be able not to only focus on permanent housing, because certainly that's a good option, but I sat there for an hour and a half, and all I keep hearing is that there's a shortage of permanent housing, right? So I think we need to work both ends in terms of transitioning people that have mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues. Our facilities address those issues and then transition people into permanent housing. And like I said, we've been doing it very successfully for a long time, so that it's not a one size fits all. And we really, as a city, and we need to be able to look at everything that's available to transition our people successfully and I know we're in a time, but just one more thing. Our other concern about bridge housing and crisis housing is that it comes with no programming. That's optional. So when people come to our programs under the bridge housing or the crisis housing, or even going to permanent housing and have supportive services available, they don't necessarily have to agree to those services. So what happens 6 months after they're there and they relapse, or they don't have the skills to find a job, then what then? So I think we need to look at it long term as well while we go into this venture of permanent housing. Thank you.
Nick.
Good afternoon. Nick Greif, speaking on behalf of Councilmember David Rue. I wanted to thank the committee for hearing this item, and in particular, thank Councilmembers Harris Dawson and Jose Huizar for seconding a motion we put in 2 weeks ago around the lack, or I guess the defunding of domestic violence shelters and veteran shelters as part of the HUD notice of funding availability process. Briefly today, as I understand that the committee chair is looking at waiving this item, this motion, so that we can put it together with the CAO's report to make sure that the recommendations that come back consider that, and certainly with the questions that came today from the council members and the responses we got from LASA, as well as the comments we've just heard, it's clear that this is front of mind, and that was all we really wanted to make sure occurred, as the 2,000 beds that we would lose really is a critical portion of our prevention of homelessness, since when you look at domestic violence victims and homeless veterans, not all of those are folks that necessarily are looking at permanent supportive housing as the best and certainly the most efficient and cost-effective option. So just again, I want to thank the committee for looking at this, and thank you for considering waiving the item so that we can put it together.
Thank you. Stephanie Klasky, Gamer.
Hi again. I just wanted to speak on one specific issue. With all the refocus of homeless dollars, and LA Family Housing both runs crisis housing, transitional housing, as well as permanent supportive housing and permanently affordable rental housing. So we are along this full continuum. There's been a real shift of funding to rapid rehousing. That's cash assistance that we write checks to move people into permanent housing. The challenge is Los Angeles is facing an all-time low in vacancy. So we have 170 people sitting at our shelter in North Hollywood holding a rental subsidy, or they are eligible for rental rapid rehousing dollars, but we have no units to place them into. So I'm just urging, we do need these funds to stay in capital. And I appreciate you saying we need to be patient, that it is a long-term strategy, but it's a permanent strategy. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Before we wrap up, finally, John Walsh, Patricia McAllister, Wayne from Encino.
I'm a little confused on number 2. HUD just put the city of Los Angeles on probation for not spending $77 million for 2015. So is that what you're telling the people, why they can't get the funds for the vets and the families? Come on now, let's be honest with people. You sat on $77 million, and I keep saying it in all the city hall council meetings, and you guys looking at me like, so what? That's why they're not getting their funding. Tell them why. Okay, you guys are not doing your job. How in the heck you didn't spend $77 million and we have all these people who are homeless and living in shelters? Another thing, these shelter people, they're telling you a lot of lies. Send somebody undercover into the shelters to find out what's going on, or you go incognito. They don't give them any job assistance. They don't give them housing assistance. They let them sit there for 6 months, take their money, claiming they're saving it, and not giving them any assistance, and then push them back into the street, and it's over and over and over again. You need to break up those committees. Get rid of dismantle LASA.
Wayne from Encino. Mr. Kirkin. Sir, how are you?
Very brief. Kirkin Alwin. I'm an affordable housing developer.
Yes, you are.
The committee has discussed healthcare issues for almost half of the time that the council members were here. And this is the housing committee, and I'm going to give you my first-hand experience about the difference between affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. No question was asked during all this hearing as to the cost of each. How much is it going to cost us to bail out one person, one individual, and put into permanent supportive housing versus one person into affordable housing? It's staggering, the difference. I don't even know the number myself, but there was one testimony made, which is one full-time person to take care of 15 people in support. My kid gets one teacher for each 35 kids in a classroom. And who do we want to spend our money on? Of course, we want to show empathy to everybody who needs, but some of the facts and numbers were not asked for and recited. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, continue the matter?
Okay.
All right. So we will continue this matter, and then we're ready to go to
General public comment.
general public comment. Mr. Millman not here? John Walsh not here? Thelmy Pettis? Not here. Mike Dennis? James Porter? Mr. Porter?
When do I start? Start now?
Go ahead, sir.
All right, how you doing? Hello, my name is James Porter. I am with LA Can, also a Renters Day Coalition. I would like to remind everybody as we began the season, holiday season, there are 1,000 men and women and children without a home or on the verge of losing their home. We thank this committee for the progress that has been made this past year, but there is much more work to be done. Remember that. We got to continue our good works, and I compliment you on your works. We need immediate action on all three Renters Day priorities: rent registration, the Alice, and quality repair. Renters make LA work. Make LA work for renters by finding solutions to housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Porter. Monica Shankar. Maria Rubalcaba. Raquel Torres. And Francesca De La Rosa. Maria.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria Rubalcaba. I'm with Inquilinos Unidos, and I'm a member of the Renters Day Coalition. We would like to thank this committee for the progress that has been made, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done. We need immediate action on all three RDLA policy priorities, such as rent registry, quality repairs, and Ellis Act by Renters Day in April 2016. Quality repairs is an issue I hear every day over the phone or from a walk-in tenant who is living in a unit where the ceiling is falling in, there are mice running to and from the holes in the walls, there are cockroaches crawling through their food, and they cannot get a good night's rest due to the bed bugs on their clothes and bed sheets. As much as these tenants tell the landlord, write letters, and put in complaints with the housing and health departments, the owners refuse to address these issues, or in the event that they do said repairs, they are made with such poor quality that it is as if the repairs had not even been made. Getting to the root of the problem and performing quality repairs will assist in preserving RSO housing stock.
Who's next? Francesca?
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Torres. I'm a senior research analyst with Unite Here Local 11, the Hotel Workers Union. We stand in strong solidarity with the Renters Day Coalition, and we recognize that there are some immediate concerns and immediate ways to address these issues. One is through the short-term rental policy. As Councilmember Price mentioned about the connection between hotels and housing, we see this as an immediate impact that whole buildings are being taken off the market through short-term rentals. As much as 10,000 units, we believe, have been taken off this market. So we want to protect housing, and we are especially concerned about one of the issues involved in this, which is RSO units. We recognize that these are the most vulnerable tenants, and 85% of our total rental housing stock is composed of RSO units. So as part of our policy to protect housing, to protect tenants, we want to make sure that RSO units are not included in terms of the overall policy for short-term rentals. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Francesca Della Rosa with Works, and on behalf of the Renters Day Coalition, I just want to thank members of this committee and your staff for working with us over the past year, and for, as my colleagues have said, for the progress that we have made. We still have lots to do, and very much want to see a strong quality repairs ordinance, further LS protections. We would like to see this done before Renters Day in April 2016. And in the coming weeks, we know that we were going to hear a report back on the rent registry. We have a few weeks left. We very much want to hear that report back. And really what we'd like to do, and why we're here today, is we want to recommit ourselves in working with you and your staff in the coming year to passing substantive policy to addressing the housing needs of all Angelenos. Thank you very much.
Patricia McAllister.
Thank you for letting me speak. The last thing I like to say, and I don't believe in being politically correct, the problem won't be solved until we get these illegal aliens out of affordable housing. What the lady didn't say earlier was a lot of the affordable housing is given to illegal aliens with these vouchers, meaning they're getting $2,000, $3,000 to pay 2 months' rent and money. We've got to get the illegal aliens out of the housing. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to have homeless people, and especially African Americans, because the illegal aliens have the affordable housing that the African Americans should be in. And that is a crime. African Americans are descendants of slaves, and we have a protective category. That's in the Constitution. We are protected. And you are not to bring any illegal aliens over here and give them our benefits like housing and all kinds of subsidies. So until we address that, I know, Cedilio, your district with the illegal aliens in it have the most affordable housing. That chart you got this morning, I'm going to get a copy, believe me. But you're concentrated, District 1, and we're going to get those aliens out of there.
Okay, as the President said earlier, we apologize for hate speech and racist speech. Racism is spoken by people who have suffered racism. And
disrupting the meeting, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, just go ahead. Go on. Walton Sederif, Renters Day Coalition.
No one else is here.
Guadalupe Gonzalez. We've exhausted the public comment.
You have, sir.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you so much. Thank you.